live. I'm Jim Groom, and I am joined here today by my fellow reclaimer, Pilot Irwin. And we have the unique honor to work today and talk today with Amanda Licastro, who is a digital scholarship librarian and lecturer in English at why am I blanking?
At Swarthmore
Thank you.
College.
Aren't you better than me
In
right
the
now?
Jim, it's in the background. It's on a poster in the background.
But here's my problem. I was gonna say Bryn Mawr because we work so much with Bryn Mawr too, and I would have really messed up, wouldn't have I, Amanda?
Well, we're all part of the TRICO. We're great.
So in the right state, in other words?
Right state, and we are a part of a consortium with Bryn Mawr and Haverford. We work with them all the time.
So there you go. I almost had it. Anyway, Amanda, welcome. And today we're going to talk a bit about the future of multidimensional scholarship and what that looks like. And why we had this talk to begin with is I was at Digital Humanities 2024. Meredith Fierro and I went and we saw a whole bunch of great sessions. It was a great time. And one of those sessions we saw was Amanda. And Amanda was talking with your colleague at Swarthmore about some of those challenges of preserving particular collections, like the Peace collection you've talked about at Swarthmore. And so I thought it was a fascinating take on preservation, archiving, and bigger questions around what's to come. So we brought you here to have a little chat about that. So can you give us just basically a little bit of background about you and what you're doing at Swarthmore, and we'll get this conversation started.
Sure. And first, I have to say that I have been a big fan of your work, Jim, since my early days at CUNY, where I did my PhD in English. You not only presented there, but I read a lot of your blog posts on open access, open source scholarship that really inspired a lot of my dissertation. I'm pretty sure I've hosted my personal website and all of my course sites on Reclaim since at least 2015. If not before then, if you count the CUNY Academic Commons, which I've been a member of since 2011, and I have supported Domain of One's Own on 3 campuses, including here at Swarthmore. So long time user of Reclaim hosting.
This is kind of like a job interview too, isn't it?
I mean, really, this is just the truth. I recommend Reclaim hosting to academics whenever they're asking me where they should host their website. You have absolutely amazing technical and support and customer service. So thank you for all you do.
We were supposed to be showcasing your work, Amanda.
Well, yeah, good point.
I work with your products. So,
but the other point there, though, is CUNY. So you went to the City University of New York Grad Center. You studied with a whole community of folks who kind of built up the idea of open infrastructure through CUNY Academic Commons and beyond. So that is also a very tight connection, and it's how I first knew of your work coming up through the grad center. So it's a mutual relationship there.
Absolutely. When I started at the CUNY Graduate Center in 2011, digital humanities was still a very new field. There was probably less than you can count on one hand, right? Programs in the humanities that supported digital humanities specifically, and getting to help build that program with Matt Gold and Steve Breyer, Michael Mandeberg, and then Kathy Davidson, who completely shaped my career trajectory, was really amazing. And it also taught me a lot about infrastructure because the infrastructure didn't exist yet. We had to build it, as you say, Jim. And I feel like we're in a similar moment for multidimensional scholarship, right? The infrastructure doesn't exist yet, but we have these models like through Reclaim hosting and Domain of One's Own for the kinds of media that I studied in my dissertation and that I continue to study. And that's, multimodal composition. So we're talking about blogs and e-portfolios and, images and videos. But now that I've started working in the realm of VR and AR, 360-degree cinematic and simulation experiences and 3D models, we don't have a solution for these materials. We don't have yet a institutional repository, a CUNY Academic Commons, a Reclaim hosting that can handle both the storage of the files and the viewing of the files in a long-term sustainable way. So we're really asking a lot of the same questions we did back in 2011, but for new forms of scholarship.
Now, let me ask you this with the kind of notion of new forms of scholarship, and traditional publishing platforms or platforms for, like you brought up, CUNY Academic Commons, which is a great WordPress space that allows folks to build course groups, to blog, to build portfolios, all that. So we're kind of been down that road for 20 years. That's not new. But the road of multidimensional scholarship and some of the things you're talking about, like AR, VR, it is kind of a new road. And one of the bigger questions, I think, is open source WordPress. Despite what's going on in WordPress right now, that was a tool that was somewhat accessible and cheap to run. Now we're talking about multidimensional VR infrastructure, and we're talking about a completely new game. I don't even know. I know the space a little bit, but I can't think of too many independent open source options that you're going to really do significant research in that space. Is that fair to say?
It is absolutely fair to say. So there's a lot of ways, again, to host the files in your institutional repository. Here at Swarthmore, we have Islandora. Where we can store and view a lot of these, store and preserve a lot of these files in terms of the library. But again, it doesn't have a built-in viewer. Is that coming in the future? Sure, we hope so, right? And my wonderful head of digital services, Emily Higgs-Copen, and I work really closely about advocating for those kinds of developments and resources here in the TriCo. But they're not here yet. So what I've found is that a lot of people working in this space are currently using third-party platforms, the most popular of which is Sketchfab. Actually, I can screen share. Do you want to see? So if I click share, if I click on that window.
Just be like add to screen or something like that. Add to stage, yeah.
Oh, okay. There it goes. Great. Okay, so here's a great example. This is actually from Carleton College in Minnesota. This is Austin Mason.
Austin!
Yes. So you can see here that a lot of universities, including most of the Ivy Leagues, right? We used this at the University of Pennsylvania, are using Sketchfab to host models. Here you can see, right? You can play with the 3D models. You can download them, export them. This is, you can host open source and open access models here, or as you can see, you can also sell them right? On this platform. But Sketchfab is, a for-profit company, and they change their hosting model and their licensing models quite frequently, and are charging universities a significant amount to use their services once they get over, a certain storage limit. And we really have no control over a platform like Sketchfab. So while it's great to put our models on this platform in terms of access to the community that needs them, because it's the industry standard to go to Sketchfab to find a model that you might want to use in your virtual reality or augmented reality project. Again, it's something that we can't rely on in the long term. And this is no shade to Sketchfab, right? They have no, they're not beholden to us as the consumer for these projects. But it would be great if we could have viewers like this that were built into our own internal systems, so that we didn't have to rely on this. And maybe we could still host some models on Sketchfab, again, to connect with the community that needs them, but still preserve them and sustain them internally. Does that make sense?
Absolutely makes sense. No, and is this pretty much the predominant space? If a school is doing stuff, this is where they'll probably be.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you can, Sketchfab has a list of all the universities, using them, and you can search for universities very easily using this. I think a very common workflow right now is for cultural institutions, whether that be institutes of higher education or museums or libraries, will do their scans, and they will upload a small number of them to a place like Sketchfab to connect with the community and to get people excited about their work. And then if you are a researcher who's very serious about a scan and need a high resolution version or need more information, then you need to contact that university, because they probably have an internal workflow, right? Usually, there's so many different viewers that people are using. It's one of those very bespoke, custom kind of workflows that it's not replicated across universities. There's no like standard or common workflow for this yet. But if you reach out to universities and say, oh, actually, we store our high res scans here, and we can give you access through this private link, right? Or we can share the files through this very specific, format that we have drummed up, right? And that is true of us at Swarthmore. So I'll go to this tab here. If we have our own Get Pages site, and we have a Django backend to that. And here we host our virtual reality gallery and our featured scans, which, can you see them loading? Are they loading pretty well here? Right? Which you can play with here. And that's kind of our, again, very customized, bespoke solution. And everything is extremely well documented. So just to let you know, if you go to our documentation here, you can see how we built absolutely everything. It's all right here. You can see my students are wonderful at documenting step-by-step everything that they do to test out all of our equipment, to test out all of our platforms that we use. So this is something that I'm very passionate about sharing and talking about across the community until we find a good standardized way of doing this, until we find some more tools that are lower barrier to entry, like a Sketchfab, but still open and play well with the systems that we have internally.
So with this one, Amanda, let me know if I'm correct. This is basically, you've built a site and a resource for Swarthmore around SketchLab. So a
No.
Sketchfab. Or
No, so we also have a Sketchfab just like everyone else, just because again,
Okay.
where we meet the community. But this is a custom site,
And
right?
does it bring in your work from Sketchfab?
No,
Like,
these are viewers that are built in to
Okay.
gotcha.
to the
Okay.
Django platform, right? And again, this is all, you can go to our GitHub and fork this, so anyone can use this template that we have created. But that it does take a certain amount of digital literacy, right? It takes a certain amount of coding skills, of web design skills, familiarity with GitHub, familiarity with Django, right? Like it's
Yeah.
not like anyone is going to be able to do this in the way with Sketchfab. It's really WYSIWYG point and click, right?
It's interesting too, because as we talk about infrastructure and this stuff, right? Like we start to get into some of these questions around bespoke, like you had said with this. And one of the things I thought was very liberating about the moment of infrastructure we live in is, let's just say your group does this, they build this, it works out, it looks amazing. And then you want to share it widely with people who may have access to, say, Docker containers. And so I wonder if like some of the documenting and some of, whether, hey, universities will come together and get a grant around some of this stuff, is to take what you've already built and then abstract it using something like Docker containers so that people can very simply spin their own version up. Now, that also means that you have to have, white labeled CMS entries and all wherever you put in your content, your stuff. But like, I wonder if this isn't the beginning of part of what you're talking about with alternatives, if you will.
That's a great question. And here's where it becomes complicated, is that this at Reclaim Hosting, but when you're talking about hosting media files, you start to get into very large numbers very fast. When you are hosting 3D models or VR experience, you're talking about your AWS bill skyrocketing, right? So could I scan the entire piece collection in 3D if I had unlimited human hours, like human labor? Sure. Could we afford to host all of those models? No. Right? Like the team that pays my AWS bill would be very mad at me. Right? And I don't even like that we have to rely on AWS for that solution, but it is like the largest server space that we have. And I'm sure, as you know, like universities have been put under a lot of pressure in terms of server space because Google Docs has stopped unlimited storage. A lot of our other solutions have stopped unlimited storage in the higher ed sphere. So, we are relying more and more heavily on AWS and less on a variety of server options and storage options. So, I don't think, even if I could, even if I had the human labor, right, hours to scan a huge number of artifacts or collection items from our collection, that storage cost is still, and it's not just a cost in terms of financial costs. We can talk about this, but it's also an environmental impact, right, that we're talking about here. So that's also a huge question I have, is like the question of what should be scanned, why, who needs access to what, who gets to make those decisions, how do we prioritize what gets scanned, and that's really an issue of equity. It's an issue of social justice. It's an issue of representation, right? Both in terms of the creators of the artifacts and the collections themselves, but also, right, the digital scholarship technicians that are working to provide access to the collection.
So how do you guys answer that question at Swarthmore? Like, so
Well,
when you have your collection that you're gonna, model 3D for particular pieces, what would you decide to archive, for example?
yeah, so I'm going to show, can you see this? Did my tab?
Yes, coming through.
Here we go. I'm going to reboot it there. Okay, so this is a great example of how we make those decisions. In the Peace Collection, because it is a collection of peaceful protests around the world, we have a lot of what you see here, which is protest art or posters, right? And these posters are high priority because they are made of cardboard and tissue paper. They are huge. Here's a person, right? It's the size of
boy, yeah.
a human, right? And they are they are problematic in several ways. They're too large to store in our normal, archival storage, which is really designed for files, for paper, for books, for meeting notes, for compact compact objects. They're also problematic because the materiality, right, of cardboard and tissue paper means that if it's too humid, if it's too dry,
Lifespan.
water, if there's mold, right, this is all a huge problem for an object like this. And also, it really can't be handled a lot. It's just too fragile. What you don't see here is that this dove is actually one of 6 that all connect to each other that would have been held by 6 people in a march. So imagine 6 of these, right, in your storage room. It's really difficult. So a lot of our priorities are exactly that, right? Like, this has to be moved. This has to be dealt with. And if I go back to our LibLab site here, you'll actually see the bus is part of that same collection. So this bus looks small here, but this is actually, again, like a human-sized poster, that would have been held in a march. It's part of the same collection. So we have a ton of these really enormous objects that are proposing to my friends in special collections really difficult preservation and storage problems. So these objects need to be moved off-site to temperature-controlled warehouses that we share with other universities in the area. And they need to be limited access. So if we can create really high resolution scans like the ones you see, researchers can still study these objects in great depth. Like if you could see here, I can really zoom in, right, to this object. I can get really pretty detailed. And by the way, I have this so you can view it in the space, but you can view it just as an object as well, right? You don't have to view it in context of the space. I just wanted to give you this sense of scale here. But you can get a pretty good sense of it for at least an initial encounter using scans like we have here. And then if they need us to recall it from off-site storage because they're doing a really specific study of the materiality, we can do that. But these scans are going to be pretty good for most researchers. And again, I want to emphasize this. We are not trying to replace an in-person analog experience with special collections. That is always preferred by researchers, to come to our archives, to work with our specialists in the Peace Collection or in the Friends Historical Library or in college archives. But that's not always possible for lots of reasons. We have patrons who are mobility impaired, who are geographically unable to access Swarthmore College, and who have other perhaps disabilities that prevent them from working with these kinds of materials physically. A lot of the work we're doing around this is in terms of accessibility. So if a researcher needs to interact in a digital space with keyboard controls, with screen readers, with captioning, with alt text, how can we provide that experience to make sure everyone has access to our collection and not just the limited number of people who can walk up this extremely hilly campus in an arboretum, right, in a building that was built in the 1800s and is not up to accessibility standards, right? Like all of these reasons why these digital surrogates might actually increase access for those who can't physically be here.
Yeah, which I kind of like that idea, because also that goes against some of the, you might get pushback like, this is inaccessible for X amount of people, given the fact that you are scanning in particular ways that might depend upon, vision versus what have you. And so I think it's interesting for you to kind of also reframe, well, what are all the environmental issues that stand in the way of access, or digital beyond that? So it's interesting anyway. I really like that kind of take you have on accessibility there.
I mean, everyone's goal is universal access, but universal access is also a myth, right? There's no one form of engagement that reaches all users, right? If you make accommodations for one group of users, you're actually making it more difficult for another group of users. Kind of one of the classic examples is accommodations for the colorblind often actually make it more difficult for those with attention deficit disorder to engage with materials, right? So what I'm doing here is not replacing the in-person experience, which is great for those who can have it, but instead offering alternate forms of accessibility for those who that form of engagement does not work or could not work for a variety of reasons. We all experienced this during lockdown as well, right? We had hundreds of thousands of researchers who couldn't do archival research for years and still had to make progress on their dissertations or book projects or articles that they were writing. And digital surrogates played a huge role in that. And 2D scans can get us pretty far with some objects, but with objects like the ones you see here, they're not a great way of interacting with these 3D objects, right? Like a 2D picture of that dove or that poster is actually not going to tell you as much as you need to know. So if I was researching, protest art in this time period and was experiencing a lockdown or a quarantine, I don't think a 2D scan would have given me the object-oriented nature of these objects in the same way that a 3D scan can. And I also want to add that now that we can export these objects to virtual reality, you also have haptics. So you can use haptic feedback controllers, haptic feedback gloves, and haptic feedback backpacks for those who are visually impaired. And I got to point to the work of Mickey Kaufman, who's doing amazing work around this with data visualization, with multisensory engagement. And I actually here, if I go to this tab, you can also see something like, let's see, like this Touching Masterpieces project, which is, I believe, out of the National Gallery in Prague, where they're 3D scanning objects from European museums and, allowing those who have vision impairment to touch the objects from these museums with haptic feedback gloves.
Yeah, that's impressive. I mean, and it also gets into, like you said, these 3D objects now potentially take on a whole different life in a different virtual environment. So then they also become, building blocks for students to create new things with the collections. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have this virtual gallery on our site, and when we have a physical exhibits In our library of our physical collections, we create digital surrogates here. So this is meant to look like the atrium here at McCabe Library. And then you can see we can put the objects here on these pedestals or 2D objects on the walls. We can customize the space to whatever exhibit is currently on view, so people can interact with it either here in a web browser or with a VR headset. So you can actually load this into a VR headset and see it in 360 degrees as well. And this is using a program called Art Steps, which is really popular for cultural institutions to use as well. And we do have documentation for it, again, on our website, but it's only one of many. Another really popular one is spatial.io. But this actually leads me to a question we talked about, Jim, earlier, and that's there used to be more platforms like this available. My favorite personally was Mozilla Hubs from the team behind Mozilla Firefox, right? And it was open source and open access. And I used it with students for curricular engagement all the time for classes that wanted to build virtual exhibits or virtual spaces, especially if they wanted them to be social computing spaces where you'd have multiple people collaborating in a virtual space. And Mozilla Hubs shut down in May. And we're seeing these kinds of smaller, independent projects being shut down or being consumed or bought by the two biggest players in this field right now, which are Meta and Apple.
Yeah. And Apple, I just saw an announcement today, are considering stopping production of their headset. I mean, that's crazy. That's only like a year old. I don't even know how old that is.
That also makes me think of, in terms of file types and storing and long-term compatibility, switching between projects.
Yep. I had a huge number of projects on Mozilla Hubs that I had to download the data for, and they just, don't exist anymore.
And do they work, though, on these new viewers or in this new ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, they can. I haven't migrated most of them because they were one-off course projects for the most part. But I'm sure there are people who had some pretty serious work on Hubs that are having to find alternatives to migrate them to. Again, the problem with these third-party platforms. And we have seen this not only with platforms and tools, but also with content. So a lot of my favorite virtual reality content that inspired me when I initially got into this field in 2017 was actually done by the big media outlets like New York Times and Guardian. Both the New York Times and the Guardian had VR apps that you downloaded on your phone. And those VR apps, this is what I loved about it, is that the traditional print media of the New York Times and the Guardian had your traditional journalistic article published, and then they would pair it with a VR experience that was on their app. So you'd read the article and consume that traditional form of media, and then you'd put a Google Cardboard, on your head with your phone and experience an immersion that complemented that traditional form of media. So it was pairing the new media with the old media in a way that I found really compelling. And I still find myself doing that when I introduce a virtual reality experience to a class or to a researcher. I often pair it with a traditional form of media that's talking about the same topic, right? That's presenting the same topic. It's, this is the skeuomorph phenomenon, right? Is taking old media and integrating it into new media to help your audience orient themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, do you find with the kind of, as you say, almost a narrowing of the field in terms of options? So pretty much, if you're going to be a researcher in this field, you don't have a choice but to use Meta, right?
Absolutely.
Maybe some marginal thing like this, doesn't Stream have something? Stream kind of made something up, or Steam, I guess it was, Valve. They created a kind of viewer. HTC has viewers, but really at the price point now, it's pretty much Meta.
It is, absolutely. I resisted, using Meta's headsets for a long time. I had an HTC Vive. I had an HP Reverb, which was actually designed specifically for educational use.
I've never heard of that one. That one's new to me. Yeah.
You should look it up. It was phenomenal. It was a phenomenal project. Hold on a second. So yeah, there were a lot of other headsets on the market that were more education friendly. Obviously, I think the Google Cardboard was the most democratizing because you could actually make them yourself. And I did this with an elementary school class. We got the long soda containers that are meant to go in your fridge, the long rectangular soda containers.
The boxes.
Yeah. So you can cut those up and get your own lenses and a magnet and make Google Cardboards yourself. And Google actually published the schematics. Like they have the blueprints for it. You can download, and I did this with a class of 5th graders, right? They all made their own Google Cardboard. So it really was extremely accessible. Now, it did rely on a cell phone, but as Pew Research tells us, 99% of the population has a smartphone. And we can usually find at least enough to support enough smartphones to support a class, right? So when we're talking about 2017 through 2022, I had a set of 35 cardboards I could bring into a class, and every single student could have their own cardboard and could be looking at New York Times content, could be looking at Guardian content. There was another fantastic VR that was very social justice oriented called the Within application.
Huh.
There was a collective called VR for Good that did social justice oriented VR content, all accessible through free applications on your phone. And then towards the end of 2020, beginning of 2023, when Apple released their new headset, they stopped supporting any VR content on your Apple phone. So you could no longer use an Apple phone as a VR viewer. You had to use a headset. So only the people who had Android phones could use those applications anymore. So almost all of them shuttered that year.
Apple did that intentionally. So arguably you'd buy this new headset as a viewer.
Correct.
Wow. What a jump with the price point of that headset.
Yeah. I mean, a Meta Quest 3 you can now get for $299, and the Apple Vision is $3,500.
Yeah.
And a Google Cardboard is $5 or free if you want it. I mean, practically free for the price of a magnet and 2 lenses, which is a cents at your hardware store.
I was going to say, I was thinking about, you mentioned, well, it does depend on access to a smartphone, but lots of people have smartphones. The other thing is that by and large, a smartphone is going to be a more multi-use device. Right. So if you're trying to get people to purchase a device that they can use for VR, or if you're trying to offer that to people, the smartphone is just usually more affordable and just a better pick.
Absolutely. I mean, cell phones are like a Swiss Army knife, right? And a VR headset's more a unitasker, right? Yeah. Absolutely. I still think that there is a place in higher education for a VR headset, and I see it. So we have 15 here at Swarthmore. I had 20 when I was at UPenn. In the last academic year, I had VR headsets integrated into 20 courses across the curriculum. Remember, Swarthmore is extremely small. We have 1,500 students. So that's actually a huge percentage, right, of our courses. And at Penn, I had it integrated into 26 courses, right, across the curriculum. And that was during lockdown years when when a lot of our courses were still hybrid or online. So I've seen every single discipline use these headsets for wildly impressive and engaging ways of really helping students grapple with very difficult content. And I think some of the reasons why they're effective is because when this is research that comes from a great book that was just published about focus. And I heard an interview with the author who said, the average college student in the United States believes, and this was done with, they surveyed thousands of college students, that they can pay attention to 7 forms of media at once. 7 forms at once.
Only 7?
So that means, they're looking at their TikTok, they're looking at their computer, they're maybe looking at a physical book, they're also doing their laundry, they have music on in the background, right? 7 forms of media at once. And they believe they can pay attention and consume the content from all 7 at the same time. And neuroscience says 2. And those are 2, and we're talking about like maybe you're washing the dishes and listening to someone tell you a story, not like looking at TikTok and reading an academic article.
I was going to say overlapping senses. What are you washing dishes or folding laundry and listening to something are just 2 totally different spheres, as opposed to watching TikTok and reading at the same time. It's like, I don't know about that one.
Yeah. And actually, Kathy Davidson, who I mentioned before, has a great book on this, How We Think. We're talking about how people think they can multitask, how multitasking can be very effective in the 21st century, but how also we've gotten to the point where we're trying to pay attention to so many things at once that we are actually losing some of the content. So you imagine you send a student a YouTube video, a TED Talk, a film to watch as, a homework assignment. And they're also, trying to pay attention 3, 5, 7 other things at the same time. When you ask a student to engage with content in a VR headset, it is strapped to their head. They cannot look down at their phone. They can't be folding their laundry. They can't be listening to something else or trying to engage with something else. They have to be fully immersed in that content. So it really does reduce distraction, and that is highly effective for a lot of learners.
The idea that part of your work over the last, 5 to 7 years has been working with faculty to integrate, these technologies into their curriculum and find ways to, open the door so people get a new approach is what a cool job, right? It's like instructional technology at the next level, like at the frontier. I love it.
I can talk through a couple examples that we did.
Oh, it's amazing.
If you go to our LibLab site here, you can see that there's a sign-up form that faculty can fill out, and then when you go to our documentation, you can actually see course usage, and you can see like a list of courses that it's been integrated into. I would love to talk about a couple of these courses here so you can get some examples of the kinds of things that we've been doing. So for example, in Chinatown Then and Now, for those of you outside the Philadelphia context, there's a stadium that is being proposed to be built in Philadelphia in Chinatown. And the residents of Chinatown are very hesitant to agree to this proposal. And this class wanted to research the history of Chinatowns across America. They looked at New York, LA, and Philadelphia. And they also wanted to understand how these ethnic enclaves have been gentrified over the years, and how, corporate or capitalistic proposals have been encroaching on their area and impacting their community. So what we did is there's this amazing VR application called Wander, WANDER. And the students all put on the headsets, went to Philadelphia's Chinatown, and then when you flip up your wrist in the VR application, you can pick any year across the last 2 decades and see what you're looking at on that year.
That's awesome.
Yes. So they looked at businesses in Chinatown and saw the gentrification happening, and they saw which businesses remained the same and which businesses had high turnover. Maybe which ones went from being authentic Chinese owned and Chinese serving, businesses, and then were gentrified over the years. And then with my wonderful colleague, Simon, who's our social science librarian, we went into the archives and we researched the businesses that they identified through the VR app, and looked at deeds, census, archival documents about those businesses. Then they worked with a cultural liaison in Chinatown and interviewed those business owners about what has happened to them over the past 2 decades. And they got on an ArcGIS story maps site where you can tour Chinatown, learn about all of their archival research, hear from the oral history work that they did, and then at the end, there's a call to action to sign a petition against the stadium moving in.
It sounds a lot like you've done what you had studied in the Guardian or the New York Times, but now as part of a class project, which is brilliant. I mean,
yeah. And the other one I'd love to talk about is the Chinese art class you see for Tiffany Lee. So this was really amazing because, as you can see there on the far column, for years, Tiffany had been having students look at 2D images of these caves in China. And these caves are extremely remote. They're like, built into the side of a mountain that are very difficult to travel to, limited access. So they have been looking at images on slides and in textbooks, but they're caves, right? They're spaces that people enter. And in the caves, every inch of the walls and ceiling are painted with intricate paintings. And Tiffany came to me and said, can we give students an immersive experience where they can actually feel the space of this cave, how big and small they are, where the paintings are in relation to where you're standing, the difference between one wall and the ceiling. Yeah. So I looked it up, and there was actually a UNESCO World Heritage Tour of one of, I think there's something like 54 caves. Now, I'm not an expert on the caves, but there was a World Heritage Tour of one of the caves where there was an expert who was guiding you through a tour of one single cave. And then there was a really cool simulation where they had done 3D scans of 6 of the caves, but there was no expert narration. And this was on the Steam platform for the HTC Vive and Oculus Rift. So what we had students do is they all put on a MetaQuest headset. They did the UNESCO World Heritage Tour. Then they picked one of the 6 caves that were in the separate application. That was the 3D scans, but with no narration. And they recorded their own 360-degree tour through screencasting technology, and they turned in videos of their own tours.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
I love that.
That is super cool, actually. And also using the found kind of narration to reinforce what they did. So good.
And they had to research that cave. They had to understand the art. They had to explicate the art based on their research. So they were doing a very traditional research project, but they were doing it while learning a cultural heritage skill, right? Which, it's professionalization, it's learning the skills of if they wanted to, obviously these are students in an Asian art class, so they might be thinking about a career in cultural heritage institutions. And does it replace going to these caves in China? Absolutely not, right? You should go to the caves in China, but how many people, unfortunately, we're not bringing all of these students, right, to China for this experience. I hope they all study abroad and get that experience in person. But if you can't have that experience, this is something that allowed them to understand the experience of seeing the art in a much more immersive way than, the pictures in a textbook.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, are these projects available online publicly, the Chinatown and the Caves projects? Because we actually have Mark Corbett Wilson in the chat has been asking to see if they're available.
Oh, great. For some reason, I don't see the chat. But yes, I can send the link to the Chinatown. That is completely public. We don't have all of the tours public because they were a graded assignment. And as you know, there's kind of FERPA issues around sharing graded assignments. But the Chinatown site is absolutely available. And I can, actually, if you let me stop screen sharing, I can pull it up and then.
Right. Absolutely.
Add the link to the chat. How do I do that? Oh, there. Perfect. Okay. So these are, digital scholarship projects, and the way I think a lot of people traditionally understand them, where we're helping support faculty, end to end from conception, where we give them readings about this material. They're doing critical theory around this material. They're, I often have them read things by Lisa Nakamura and Jasmine Clark on the problems with representation in virtual spaces and accessibility issues. Do you see it? Can you see it?
We do.
Okay, great. Now, if I put it under comments, can people see it? Is that
we run our chat through Discord, but if you put it in comments, I'll be able to grab it and share it there.
Okay, great. So there's the link. There's the link for
He also referred to your work as augmented accessibility, which I thought was a nice description. But it goes again to Chinese caves. Like you're not going to get everyone there. It's just a financial access issue, but yet they can still study and, in some ways inhabit those caves virtually. So I really like that kind of approach you're taking, an argument for these. I think these class, like I've done a lot with blogging over the years, right? But like I like it because as a technologist, I'm like, wow, what
Well,
a cool project that would be to work on.
but Jim, if you scroll this reminds me of a lot of academic blogs. Like, look at this. Like,
Yeah,
when you pick a point in the map, and I particularly I think the Pennsylvania Convention Center example is really brilliant because this student did an incredible amount of research, but the same thing happened. So when the Philadelphia Convention Center moved into Chinatown, according to these oral histories and the research the student did, the convention center team had made a lot of promises about how the convention center was going to bring business to Chinese restaurants in Chinatown. And what ended up happening is that it is the backside of the convention center that faces Chinatown, and there's no entry or exit from the convention center towards Chinatown.
interesting, right? Yeah.
So that was a lie.
Right.
Yeah.
So, this community has been burned by these promises in the past. So you can see why they're protesting this current development. And if you look at this, it's extremely, well researched work that these students did here. And again, you can search by going through the points on the map. You can see, the images the students took of the folks that they interviewed and the places that they went. You can also scroll in kind of like a traditional blog style, endless scroll. And then, sorry, I'm going to fast scroll. I hope it doesn't make anyone sick. But when you go to, sorry for the endless scroll. When you go to the bottom, they created this collaborative timeline of events, and then you can see the call to action buttons to sign the petition or to learn more from the community liaisons they worked with.
Yeah. And so I'm interested now, like you're doing the projects, you have these great scans, you're integrated in the class, like all the stuff to get a new technology like that understood and part of a larger discussion at a liberal arts school or beyond. So like, what's your sense of the future of this? Like, there are other questions and challenges we talked about with it being kind of fewer and fewer companies, and some of the other questions is space and infrastructure to run it. Like, so given you've been in it and you've kind of been kind of on the cutting edge of this field, what's your sense of where it's going and where you want to see it going?
So a lot of what we've been talking about here is representational virtual reality, or using digital surrogates, right? Scans to provide access. But there's actually a whole area of research that's therapeutic virtual reality too. So if we go back to my, right, this is one of my favorite projects, is the treating phantom limb pain out of the University of Pennsylvania. But there's actually, especially in the medical community, a lot of uses for both AR and VR that are saving people's lives. Right? They're part of treatment plans where you have surgeons who are wearing a HoloLens on their head while performing surgery in order to see scans right above the patient to reduce error, who are able to, see inside a patient as they're operating laparoscopically, right? And who are using applications like this phantom limb pain application. This is being used by researchers at Stanford and University of Michigan, where they have patients who have lost the use of a limb, but the limb is still there. So if you've lost the use of your legs, but your legs are still intact, they're having those folks suspended in air, wearing VR headsets that simulates the use of their limbs, and it's actually refiring synapses in their brains, and they're learning to walk again. Like, these patients are walking again through the use of VR, right?
That's awesome. What is you talked about the HoloLens a little bit. Like, what is that, and how is that significant?
So the HoloLens and also the Meta Quest 3 headsets are what we call mixed reality headsets that allow you to see your physical space, but with a virtual overlay. The Apple Vision is also does this, right? So you can see your lived environment, but you can see virtual objects in that lived environment. The most easy example of this that most people know is like Pokemon Go, right? Like where you could see a Pokemon running across the field and you catch it. Or if you look on Amazon or IKEA and you can see the chair in your room, see if it looks nice. Yeah. But these glasses that you would wear allow you to create virtual objects or virtual spaces in a VR setting and then view them right in your lived environment. So that's definitely, in terms of hardware, mixed reality is definitely where hardware is going. And it's the most exciting to me because it connects the design process and the iterative design process, the development process of building and making things in virtual reality and your lived experience. It's very collaborative. Like you have multiple people who can all be viewing the same virtual object and collaborating on that at the same time. That you have folks at Penn Medicine who are using the HoloLens to do virtual surgeries in remote places that don't have access to the same technologies they do. So they're helping guide people through their surgeries remotely using the HoloLens, right? So it allows for collaboration in ways that I think we've always been talking about with digital scholarship, right? Is how it promotes collaboration and community building and knowledge sharing in ways that weren't possible before. So I definitely see this, in the medical community. Also in terms of professional training, you see this technology being used for HVAC technicians, electricians, hydraulics workers. Actually, one of my favorite applications is a nursing training program, right? Construction workers who can, train on going up on a 20-foot 20-story tall skyscraper, right? And walking on the scaffolding, like, that kind of professional training is incredibly effective in these applications as well. What I'm hoping we don't lose is the social justice applications that were so incredibly dominant in the field back in 2017 and 2018, when we had a lot of independent creators, when we had a lot of filmmakers and social justice advocates and activists creating applications and being able to disseminate them very simply through these easily accessible tools. And a lot of that, again, has been like bought up or shuttered by the big tech companies. So I'm hoping that we can like reclaim that space and find a future for that kind of artistic work. The digital storytelling work that was happening early on in this field that has, I think, been quieted or suppressed in favor of video games and entertainment. And I think play is important. We just hosted a Beat Saber battle here at Swarthmore that was epic, okay, as a brain break for students before midterms, yeah? But I also want to make sure that we still have really strong digital storytelling and that those independent creators continue to have a voice in this field.
So, I mean, it's a brilliant take on the whole field. And it's like, it's like an education, just you coming on and giving us a lay of the land. But do you think, like most things, as the pendulum swings towards, just a few companies controlling it, other folks in other places will start again, small, cheap, out of control, and then that kind of, free up a little bit of the kind of focusing, because building a VR game, right, is a very different enterprise, taking, tens of millions of dollars, I imagine, just to imagine it, not to no less build it. Whereas a lot of what you're talking about is those projects that are affordable, that people can do, and there's no space for them, it sounds like, right?
So I actually see a lot of cultural heritage institutions doing this. So we talked about Carleton College. They have the Viking Longship project. I also have the Fowler Museum is doing this at UCLA.
Sure.
Penn, the University of Penn Museum is doing this. And I see a lot of them doing it for the right reasons. They're doing this because they're repatriating objects in their collections. They're creating digital surrogates to have so they can repatriate. You see this actually a lot at the British Library and across institutions in the UK doing this as well, right? And I see a lot of in the University of Vietnam is doing this, where they have an entire virtual library. Their entire library is on VR so that students who are fully remote can access all the library resources.
Wow.
Jasmine Clark at Temple is creating the virtual Blockson exhibit, which is recreating their Blockson, their Charles Blockson archive in a digital space to help teach K through 12 students library literacy and archive literacy. For those of you who don't know, in the city of Philadelphia, there's 217 public schools and only 4 librarians.
Wow.
So most
Oh
students
my
never
God.
access a library.
Crazy.
So I know. So I see cultural heritage institutions doing really phenomenal work in the multidimensional scholarship space with very few resources. The University of Vietnam's virtual library is done completely on spatial.io, which is a free product. Virtual Blockson has a very small team with a Mellon grant behind it. But these are people who believe in access, who believe in accessibility, who want to provide this kind of access and literacy to their communities and who are doing it with very little resources. And I think that gives me a lot of hope for the future, right? That together we will solve some of these problems about long-term sustainability and preservation. But as my friend likes to say, we're laying the tracks as the train's going.
Yeah, especially in this field, right? Like, yeah, it's funny. VR, it's like one of those things back in like 2005, 2006. They said mobile learning, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, right? And it did hit, but never as they said it would, and some kind of. But VR and AR have always been like they're already here, to your point. But there's this sense that they still haven't arrived for what we need them to do, and I just don't know we fully understand what we need them to do. I think that's probably a bigger problem. But after this session, I have a much better idea of what I want to be when I grow up. Now, is I think I want to try and integrate VR and AR into the curriculum because it just sounds so brilliant, and you laid it out so well, Amanda. So thank you for joining us, for spending the time and being unbelievably compelling as a talker. I mean, it's just amazing.
Well, thank you so much. I could obviously talk about this forever. So thank you for giving me the time and space and for having the conversation with me. It's really my honor to be talking to you today.
Right. Well, thanks again, Amanda. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We'll definitely post links and the like. And who knows, we may even hear from Amanda again. So big fan, Amanda. Thank you.
Thank you.